I want to start by explaining the title of this talk. I mean, it is, of course, the Darwin Symposium and the Year of Darwin, so obviously that was the theme. But I got started thinking about Darwin and Madagascar and what would Darwin say, because Oliver Sacks, the famous psychiatrist and well-known author, visited the Lemur Center earlier this year and absolutely was entranced with the lemurs. I mean, just fell in love with them. And he and I started corresponding, much to my delight. So in a series of letters, we wrote back and forth. And at one point he said, "Did Darwin know about lemurs? And if so, what did he think?" And I wrote back and I said, I don't really know if he knew about lemurs, because at the time Darwin was doing his work and traveling the world and studying natural history, lemurs were known to Europe, but only primarily by the French. So anyway, that sort of prompted me to think about this. And then I started thinking along the lines of, wow, if he had gone to Madagascar, we might have had the origin of species a lot faster than we did. But anyway, so I posed the question, what would Darwin say? And I'm not sure I'm really going to answer that, but it'll be a theme that weaves through the talk. Okay, so we all think of Darwin, when we think of Darwin, we think about adaptive radiations and Darwin's finches. That's, and the Galapagos Islands, that was his, apparently, the real catalyst, or at least is portrayed as such, in, bringing it all together for him, the theory of natural selection. And I found this quote of his that shows what a passionate naturalist he was. But when on shore and wandering in the sublime forest, surrounded by views more gorgeous than even Claude ever imagined — I have no idea who Claude is — I enjoy a delight which none but those who have experienced it can understand. So I'm imagining him having this, this experience in a place like this, the Galapagos, which are truly lovely, but are, sort of desert islands, and I don't think of them as glorious forests. So this is my image of Darwin wandering around, having this sublime experience. Now, what would have happened if he had been in Madagascar? So I want to read to you this quote by Philippe de Commerson, who was a French naturalist, and he writes in 1771, "May I announce to you that Madagascar is the naturalist's promised land. There you meet bizarre and marvelous forms at every step." And I'm here to tell you that this is true. So Madagascar is special, and let me count the ways. It's the world's 4th largest island. It has been isolated from all other land masses for at least 88 million years. It's a microcontinent that's comprised of microhabitats and microclimates, as you'll see. So when someone asks me, what's Madagascar like? I say, well, that depends. What part of Madagascar are you asking about? The levels of species endemism are greater than 90% in vertebrate groups. Now, that's what really lights my candle. So what that means is that 90% of the species of vertebrates that you find in Madagascar are found in Madagascar and nowhere else on Earth. So that's a remarkable statistic. It's one of the world's hottest biodiversity hotspots, as defined by Myers et al. In their landmark 2000 paper. And what they mean by that is it's a place where there are exceptional concentrations of endemic species that are undergoing exceptional loss of habitat. And that is certainly the case in Madagascar. And finally, Madagascar is, much more prominent these days. So, I'm very pleased to see that so many people are interested in Madagascar. But, so we have a sense maybe that it's an island, it's constrained geographically, so we probably know pretty much everything there is to know about Madagascar. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not true. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of biodiversity discovery in Madagascar. And one reason is it's just so hard to get around there. And at the end of the talk, there'll be a little slideshow of transportation or lack thereof in Madagascar. Okay, so just to give you a hint of what Madagascar is like, it's 1,600 kilometers north to south, 480 kilometers east to west, and it's characterized, sort of generally speaking, ecologically, by a very wet sort of rainforest, alpine east, and a very dry, lowland, sort of deciduous west. And that's sort of the broad categorization of Madagascar. So anyway, here's just a few shots of, some of the prime localities in Madagascar. So you can imagine Darwin wandering around in all of this splendor and really having quite a time of it. And everywhere you look, as Philippe de Carmasson said, you see these magnificent creatures, chameleons. Every rock you turn over essentially has something you've never seen before. And the way I describe it is you can say, hey, there's a tree, but you can't tell what kind of tree it is. Hey, there's a snake, but it's a snake you've never seen before. Hey, there's a bird, but it's a bird you've never seen before. So that's what it's like to be in Madagascar. And also, it's a place of remarkable diversity. So almost half of the world's species of chameleons live on Madagascar. 6 of the world's 8 species of baobab trees are found only in Madagascar. So in the whole continent of Africa, there are only 2 species of baobab trees, but in this tiny, relatively speaking, island, there are 6 of the world's species. And what you will hear a lot about from here to forth are the lemurs. So nearly 20% of Earth's living primates are found in Madagascar and nowhere else on Earth. And I sort of did a back of the envelope calculation measuring Madagascar's relative landmass area to the rest of the world, and it's 0.4% approximately of the world's landmass, and yet it contains almost 20% of our living primate species. So there's really something quite remarkable about Madagascar. And just for fun, I'll give you a sort of a tour of the lemurs. And nearly all of these photographs, all the really great ones, are taken by David Herring, who is our registrar at the Lemur Center and our photographer. This is a shifaka, which represents the Indrid lineage, and these are the great acrobats of the lemurs and of the primates, really. This is a fat-tailed dwarf lemur. It's the world's only hibernating primate, so very interesting. You can see right here where it's storing fat in its tail, thus the fat-tailed part. So it stores up the fat, and half of the year it crashes out and goes into a hole in a tree or underground or wherever to sleep it off while resources get scarce. The world's smallest living primates live in Madagascar. This is a mouse lemur. This is a gigantic, adult, robust male. You can see he's very vigorous. Also, the diversity of lemurs is just remarkable. So we have diurnal, gregarious lemurs, like these ring-tailed lemurs that are active during the day and live in large family groups. We have more solitary, nocturnal lemurs, like these avahi, and I took this photograph, photo by me. And we have lemurs who are cuter than a bug's ear. This is a baby bamboo lemur, Hapalemur griseus, and it eats strictly bamboo. I could give a whole seminar on bamboo lemurs. 3 species can live syntopically within the same stand of bamboo because they partition the resources so carefully. And then we have the scary, don't want to meet them in a dark alley, eyes, even though they are the kindest and most gentle lemurs of all. And again, they deserve their own seminar, but I'm going to move on. Okay, now, but what Darwin, I think, would have really been struck by had he had time to spend in Madagascar and really think about what the signal is that the biota are giving, is something that my friend Dave Krause, who's at SUNY Stony Brook, calls a pattern of imbalance and endemism. And in this case, he's just talking about Madagascar's terrestrial mammals. So what he means by imbalance is that there's an imbalance between what is present there and what is absent there. And I'm not going to, belabor this, but if you just do a present-absent list, and these are all of the mammals, terrestrial mammals that are found in Africa that are not found in Madagascar. So In Madagascar, the only terrestrial mammals that you find are primates, carnivorans, rodents, and tenrecs. That's it. There are 2 extinct groups, this thing called Plesiorycterapus, which we don't even know what it is. Ross McPhee from the American Museum of Natural History has put it in its own order, so it really is a head scratcher. And at one time there was a pygmy hippo there. Now, endemism I've already told you about. It means that to be a mammal in Madagascar means to be unique to Madagascar. So if you look at the primates, the carnivorans, the rodents, and the tenrecs, 100% endemic, certainly at the species level and all the way up to very, very high taxonomic levels. So it's a remarkable pattern, and it begs an explanation. So the sort of obvious explanation, I mean, you know, a biogeographer could look at a present-absent list like this and see the patterns of endemism and would immediately say, ha, it must be isolated. It's probably, by itself and not connected to other parts of the world. And sure enough, that's the case. Here's Madagascar, and here is the east coast of Africa. The 2 land masses are separated by 400 kilometers of ocean, and it's a very deep oceanic rift. I want to emphasize that. So changing sea levels would never have mattered to readiness of, you know, transport between the 2 land masses. So, you know, hold that in your mind. Okay. Now, also important when you're asking questions about why is not just, you know, what do we see, but it's when, and, you know, the hows relate as much to when as to what. So we want to look at Madagascar's history on, you know, on planet Earth and see what is going on. So let me just orient you here. So for the next couple of minutes, your favorite place on Earth is right here. This is Madagascar. And this up here is a time ticker. This is 200 million years ago, and this is the supercontinent Pangaea. So what we're going to see is we're going to see Pangaea breaking up over time, and we're going to move closer and closer to the present. So just to get you oriented, here's Madagascar, here's India, here's Antarctica, here's Australia, this is Africa, here is South America, here's North America, and this series of islands is what is going to become Asia. So here we go. Okay, so nothing happens for a while other than sort of rotation north and to the east. And at about 175 million years ago, you're going to start seeing a separation here of what is called Laurasia and Gondwana. And almost immediately thereafter, you start to see Madagascar separating from Africa. So here's this big separation between Laurasia and Gondwana, and here is Madagascar separating from Africa and sliding south and pretty soon east relative to Africa. So again, not much is going to happen for a while until about 130 million years ago. That is when the final break occurs, and Madagascar, attached to India, starts to make its way east and rotating north. So again, for a while, not much is going on. You can just watch it, everything cooking along. And where are we? Yeah, so at 88 million years ago, you're going to start to see the separation of Madagascar and India. So we're waiting for that. Tick, tick, tick. And there it goes. All right, and from this point forward, Madagascar is isolated from the rest of the planet, and that's the point. So from 88 million years ago, Madagascar is all by its lonesome. There's something fun about to happen, though, at 65 million years ago, where India is going to have some volcanism and scoot in geological time across the Indian Ocean, and just sort of in the early Eocene, around 50 million years ago, it's slamming into Asia, building the Himalayas, and so on and so forth. But again, the main point that I want you to hold on to is here's Madagascar all by its lonesome. Okay, so for a long time, I would give this presentation, and arms would go up at the end, and I think, oh, great talk, because lots of questions. And they would say, who did that animation? So heading you off at the pass, Christopher Scotese, it's called the Paleo Map Project, and you can Google Paleo Map Project, and it's a fabulous website, and there are all kinds of downloadables. This I had to pay for, but it's a very cool site, and he's a very good geologist, so I'd like to give him a plug. I waited for years for that animation, and finally there it was. Okay, so the questions that I like to ask in my lab and the sort of motivating historical biogeographic questions that have driven much of my research over the past years, I won't say how many, are these. How many times, when, and by what mechanisms did terrestrial mammals, and now we're expanding that to vertebrates, there's several people from my lab group here, and we're doing frogs and snakes and bats and you name it. If it has a backbone, we're interested. So these are the things: how, when, and what. How did they get there? Okay, so I think most educated or intelligent people would say, well, look at the fossil record and see what the fossil record tells you, and then you can at least have a minimum date of arrival for all these different groups that you're interested in. Well, I'm afraid to tell you that when you look at the fossil record in Madagascar, the terrestrial fossil record, for the period of time when primates were doing their things and most other mammals, it's pretty much zero. So way back in the Cretaceous, we have Gondwanatheres, Metatherians, which are sort of marsupial relatives, and all these unrelated eutherians. We have no placental mammals in the fossil record prior to the subfossil record, which is very recent past, like the past 2,000 years or so ago. So these are evolutionary contemporaries of the living animals that we see there now. And people then, usually ask me, well, why aren't there any terrestrial fossils? Well, it's not that they don't exist. They're probably underneath the rainforest, and they're there somewhere, but we just can't get to them yet because the exposures aren't there. And a geologist could better explain to you why we don't have the exposures. But essentially, all of the fossil beds that are at all active are on the western part of Madagascar. And the most recent one that we have is the late Cretaceous. So it's just, all of the period of history that we're interested in just has not yet been exposed, or if it was exposed, it's been, turned back under. Okay, so how do we decide? How do we start to answer these questions? Well, here's where Charles Darwin comes in. This is a very famous illustration from one of his notebooks where he's just kind of doodling, and it says, "I think," and then there's some other prose over here. And what he's thinking about is he's thinking about how all organisms derive from a common ancestor through the mechanism of speciation and natural selection. So in essence, he's talking about all living creatures have a common ancestor, and that ancestor has left descendants. And so there's a pattern to that ancestor-descendant relationship, and this is what we call a phylogeny. So Darwin was the first phylogeneticist, which we're all very proud of, all of us who do phylogenetics. We tout this regularly. And indeed, anybody that talks about who's a phylogeneticist and talks about Darwin is sure to point out that the one and only figure in The Origin of Species is this one, which is a phylogeny. So he's showing here is this common ancestor, and here's all these branching speciations that occur over history and extinctions, drawn by these, lines that lead nowhere. And then here finally we have the living forms. So we can reconstruct potentially this tree and learn from it. Okay, I'm not going to burden you with all of this text, but again, I was pondering Oliver Sacks's question, so I spent, a mind meld, number of hours with Googling lemur and Darwin and Madagascar and Darwin and so on and so forth. And actually, he did discuss lemurs here and there. And in one case, in this case in particular, in The Descent of Man, he's talking about all the lemurs that he's ever looked at and what their brain structure, how it is structured, and then he's comparing it to marmosets, monkeys, old world monkeys, baboons, apes, etc., and saying that there's always a distinction. In every lemur, there's one kind of brain arrangement, and in these anthropoid primates, there's another. So what he was saying, essentially, is he is giving us the first clues about how to do phylogenetics, which is to define evolutionary characteristics that define what we call clades, or evolutionary groups. So in this case, that prose was saying that in the anthropoids, or all the monkeys, apes, and humans, that the cerebellum is entirely hidden by the cerebral lobes, whereas in the strepsirrhines, and in this case he was just talking about the lemurs, the cerebellum is only partially visible from above. So these are synapomorphies, and anyway, I'll move on, but I don't want to bore you to tears with synapomorphies and simplesiomorphies, but these are critical terms that we use in phylogenetics. Okay, now so how do we start to use one of these phylogenies to answer some of the questions that I posed about Madagascar and how and when things got there and where did they come from, how did they go, etc. Well, we can use phylogenies to do this, and particularly when we put geological dates on these phylogenies. So in this case, we have a phylogeny. We have Area 1 and Area 2, so we're getting into some biogeography here. And let's just call Area 1 Africa and Area 2 Madagascar, just picking randomly. And here's our phylogeny, and we see these two lineages are found only in Africa, and these two are found in Madagascar. So we infer from this tree, from the tree shape, that the ancestral area of origin is Area 1 or Africa, and that there was some kind of a colonization that occurred from Area 1 to Area 2. So here's this colonization. Now we have these things called nodes, which are the defining radiating point, the divergence point among species within these clades. And here's this one that seems to characterize the lineages found on Madagascar or Area 2, and here's this one down here, which is we assume to be in Area 1 or in Africa. So we have the crown node and we have the stem node, and so we have the shape of the tree and we have the ages of these nodes. There are methods that we can use to hypothesize the age of these nodes. So once we do that, then we have a constraint on when this colonization would have occurred. So in this case, we would have a constrained age, here and here, and so colonization would have occurred during that time from Area 1 to Area 2. Okay, when I first started getting interested in lemurs, and I was particularly interested in their biogeography, there was a rather elaborate hypothesis about their biogeographic history, and this was in all the textbooks, and the classifications reflected this hypothesis and so on. And I looked at it and I thought, that seems a little elaborate. So that was what I did my dissertation work on. And the hypothesis went like this, that the ancestral strepsirrhine primate, which are the tooth-comb primates, which include the lemurs and the lorises, which the lorises are the bush babies and the slow lorises. So the idea was that the ancestral strepsirrhine arose on Africa, that there was a migration or a dispersal event to Madagascar, a radiation within Madagascar, and then within the dwarf lemur group, a back migration from Madagascar to Africa to give rise to the bush babies and the slow lorises. So I thought, wow, that's cool if true, but it seems, rather unlikely. So many years and data sets later, I can just give you the quick answer, and that was that I found, and others have found, that the lorises form a clade and the lemurs form a clade, and that they are sister clades. So if that previous hypothesis had been true, these guys would have been attached to the dwarf lemur lineage, which is, where is it? Right here. So we get a very different signal. And so the dwarf lemurs are actually nested well within the lemur clade. Okay, so that is, that's a pretty cool story with a lot of data looking at pretty much all the living lineages of lemurs, but it leaves out a big part of the story in that there were more than 16 species of giant lemurs, and they all went to extinction within the past 2,000 years. So as I was saying, the subfossils that we can find in Madagascar, these are evolutionary contemporaries of the living lemurs. So the question then became, well, are these part of that same did they derive from the same ancestor as the living lemurs? So using ancient DNA techniques, we went after this problem. And just to give you an idea of what, the magnificent diversity that was present in Madagascar within the primates. I mean, I already told you it's magnificent as it is, but we've lost a big chunk of that. At the time when the giant lemurs were roaming around, there was one that was about the size of a female gorilla. This is a big male gorilla, so that's a little extreme. But you see that, we had such size variation from a mouse lemur to this sort of female gorilla size thing. So it really was truly spectacular. I weep to think that these animals are gone. So anyway, we did our ancient DNA work, which was grueling and painstaking and terribly expensive. So I'm done with that. People are free to carry on this work if they choose, but I will not be doing any more of it. So I'm just sharing my pain. So the quick answer, though, what we found was here's two of these giant extinct lemurs, and they fall right within the living lemur clade. And one of the interesting things is that the eye, which was that last one that I showed you that has a very bizarre long finger and has all kinds of strange adaptations, the eye is actually the sister lineage to all the other lemurs. So that makes it very convenient for these dating purposes. Remember, I told you that you need to have that ancestral node. You need to have a date for that in order to start to postulate, when they would have arrived or colonized the island. And if we didn't have the eye, we would get a much different estimate, a much more recent estimate. But thankfully, the eye persists. Okay, but to give it to you in sort of biogeographic graphical form, the conclusion or the hypothesis is that there was a single origin of lemurs from Africa, again, to Madagascar. But once they got to Madagascar, that was it. They didn't go back to Africa. And then they radiated into all of these magnificent forms that we see today. And the actual species count of lemurs in Madagascar, we don't really even know what it is right now, but I can be comfortable with saying 70. So it's a lot. Okay, and another interesting trend that is emerging from my work and from the work of others is that pretty much any of the vertebrates that you look at in Madagascar all show this same pattern of a single origin, a single common ancestor. So all of the, the lemurs, rodents, the bangas, songbirds, carnivorans, tenrecs, these frogs, lizards, more lizards, they all have a single common ancestor that explains their presence in Madagascar. The one exception is the chameleons, and they've been bouncing around the Indian Ocean like ping pong balls, and that's a whole other story, very cool, but I don't have time for it right now. Ask Chris Raxworthy, he will be happy to tell you. Okay, so that's the pattern. So remember, we have to have two parts. To start to answer these questions. We have to have the pattern and we have to have the time. So now this, asks the question, okay, well, it's a pattern of a single colonization, but when would this have happened? Okay, so I have had the pleasure of collaborating with a really brilliant guy who is a statistical geneticist and molecular evolutionist, Zhihang Yang, and with my lemur expertise and his expertise in the methods, we together wrote a series of papers where we were asking these questions, and I have to read you the title of this paper. We're very proud of it, ridiculously. And this, I want you to know this is a very prominent journal that this was published in. Okay, so it's called Comparison of Likelihood and Bayesian Methods for Estimating Divergence Times using Multiple Gene Loci and Calibration Points with Application to Irradiation of Cute-Looking Mouse Lemur Species. And there's a great story. This sort of is Zhihang's fault that we have that title. But and so we submitted the paper, and he had to talk me into submitting the paper with a title. And I said, okay, and we did. And we got all the reviews back and the associate editor's comments and so on. And the only comment that addressed this was one reviewer said, the title might be a bit long. So we just chose to ignore it, and everybody went with it. Okay, so what did we find? The quick answer is that this crown node, right? So here's the stem node. Here are the galagos and lorises. So there's the stem node and the crown node here, which is the putative common ancestor of all the lemurs. That node dates to about 62 million years ago. That's a really long time ago, tens of millions of years ago, and it was rather a surprise to us. And there are all kinds of cool things that have happened since we published this paper to continue to support the hypothesis, but I don't have time to go into it, but so just trust me. Okay, but let's go back and ask, what did the world look like 62 million years ago? What did Madagascar, more importantly, where was Madagascar 62 million years ago? Well, it was out there in the middle of the Indian Ocean, pretty much where it is now. India was still, it was closer, but it's, there was quite an oceanic barrier between India and Madagascar at that time. So it was out in the middle of the water at the time that lemurs began to evolve. So that's one puzzling point. Okay, but there's also something else interesting about that 62 million year ago timeline, in that, and this is as factual as it gets, really, in Earth history, that at almost precisely 65 million years ago, a giant asteroid hit the Earth, and it's now known as Chicxulub, the Devil's Tail, and it slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula, and, these things we know, that there was a giant asteroid, that it did hit the Earth at 65 million years ago, and that it was in the Yucatan Peninsula. From there, it's conjecture what were the consequences of that impact. But one of the consequences that has been proposed is that there was this 2-year winter, and darkness and wildfires, and on and on and on. And that would have led to the extinction of the dinosaurs and the rise of the mammals and so on. So that's the sort of just so story, and there's a lot of compelling evidence for that. But the fact of the matter is that it did happen, and it undoubtedly created some havoc. Now, one of the sort of more doomsday scenarios was presented by Kring and Durda in the year 2004, and by their hypothesis, and this is right at impact. So the asteroid hits the Earth, and it throws hot ash up into the atmosphere, and so there are atmospheric wildfires. And because of the Earth's rotation, these wildfires would have quickly spread around the globe, and you'll note that Madagascar might well have been in the path of these wildfires, and that over the course of the next number of hours, these wildfires raged, and would have been rather disastrous to living organisms. So it's quite possible that when lemurs arrived in Madagascar, Madagascar was sitting out in the middle of the water, isolated from all other land masses, and it could have just had its sort of ecological slate cleaned, potentially. So it's possible that lemurs arrived in Madagascar to a brave new world, where there are no predators and no competitors, and the living was easy. And certainly, if we look at the patterns of other groups of organisms, other mammals, it does look like Madagascar has been something of a speciation laboratory, because, as I was saying about the baobabs and the chameleons and the lemurs, there's just such, to get to Madagascar is to radiate into lots of species. So what's up with that? Well, a recent hypothesis has been presented. It was published in the journal Science a couple of years ago, and what this hypothesis says is that there have been periods of cooling and drying, pulsing with periods of warming and more moisture. So when times are warm and the climate is wet and there's lots of rainfall, that you would have had forests pretty much all over Madagascar. This is supposed to represent a mountain peak, and that organisms could just traverse east to west, north to south with ease within these forests. But when things cool down and dry out, these forests would contract and stay close to riverbeds down in the sort of coastal areas, and then up at the high elevations it would maintain the moisture. So these are called retreat dispersion zones, and these are called areas of endemism. And so that there would have been this pulsing between this, full coverage of forest pulsed with these, fragments, and that would have been a potential engine to drive speciation. So people are testing this hypothesis as we speak, and the jury is still out. Oh, people, the lemur's getting around. Okay, so we know I know a few things about lemurs, in that they're a very old group. They've been in Madagascar since 62 million years ago. Madagascar might have well been depauperate of placental mammals of any sort when lemurs arrived, and that since that time, because we can look at the data and see there are so many species of lemurs now, that there's been this engine of speciation. Now this, there is what there is in Madagascar, and we as biologists, it's our job to try to find it and describe it and justify our hypotheses, our species hypotheses. So I can tell you that within the last decade, we have gone from 2 described species of mouse lemurs to 16, and that a lot of these putative species of mouse lemurs are based strictly on mitochondrial DNA analysis, because if you look at these putative 3 different species of mouse lemurs, they look pretty darn similar. And also there might be some politics involved with seeing all these species of mouse lemurs. For one thing, many of them have been named after famous lemur biologists, or named after the people that have funded this research that, in this case, Simmons Eye, these big donors who are giving money to these biologists, so they get a lemur named after them. And also, the press loves mouse lemurs. So anytime, over the last decade that somebody described a new mouse lemur, everybody went crazy and, got all excited about it. So this begs the question, is this good science or not? So what gives? Does any of this have actual biological meaning? What is, as scientists, can we, lift our heads high and call these species? Okay, well, I'm one of these people that was traumatized by species concepts as a graduate student, and so there are as many species concepts as there are people in this room, and I kid you not. So this is my sort of reaction to trying to, be really bold and say, this is a species, I'm sure. But I was really, again, I've been, researching Darwin and reading a lot of Darwin. I was very reassured to see that in The Origin of Species, you'll note that the book is called The Origin of Species, so it's a very important biological unit, yet nobody has a clue what it is, really. And he says, hence, in determining whether a form should be ranked as a species or a variety, the opinion of naturalists having sound judgment and wide experience seems to be the only guide to follow. So he's basically saying, you just ask the smart people and they'll tell you, and you just got to believe them. So that's actually kind of how it works. But there's more, of course. So this is a plate from the paper that was published by a Malagasy graduate student for his thesis work, where he described 8 new species of mouse lemurs, and that's sort of what started this whole thing going, and I had the pleasure of collaborating with him. But this plate is supposed to illustrate the extreme morphological differences among the mouse lemurs. And I don't know, do you see it? I don't. So one of the things that we think about then is why would there be all these species that look so similar if they really are different species? What's up with that? Well, one thing to note is that mouse lemurs are nocturnal, so they live at night. Now, if we look at ewe-lemurs, or true lemurs as they're called, and they're about the same age, because we, Zhihang and I, looked at them in comparison with the mouse lemurs, and the radiation of the ewe lemurs is about the same geological age as the radiation of the mouse lemurs. And in the ewe lemurs, you see all of this elaborate coloration, particularly on the males, so that the females can, readily identify who's the right guy for them. And if we look, these are diurnal lemurs, so they're active during the day. Now, if you think about what it's like to be a nocturnal primate, this is kind of what you see. So it's going to be hard to tell which guy's the right guy using your visual cues. But there are other cues that might be important, and those would be sound and smell. I'm not going to talk, there's a lot of data about smell in mouse lemurs, and it's very acute and very subtle. But I can tell you that there's also a lot of divergence in the advertisement calls of the male mouse lemurs. So this is a lot like birds, really. So this paper was published actually before we even hypothesized that there were so many species of mouse lemurs. So all we know is that this is a mouse lemur from the east and this one is from the west, but we don't really actually know what species they are. But if you recorded the male call of the rufous, it would sound sort of like this, chirp, chirp. And if you listen to that of the murinus, the one from the west coast, it would be zzz, sort of a buzzing sound. Now, one of the interesting things is this sort of displacement of auditory signaling is only true of the male advertisement calls. If you look at the maternal calls, if you look at predator calls, any of these other things, they're uniform across the mouse lemurs. It's just the male advertisement calls. So potentially, we're talking about speciation via sexual selection, which was one of Darwin's big subjects that he spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about. Okay, and yet another piece of evidence we have that I don't have time to explain terribly carefully, but if you look at the genetic data and you look at the geographic distribution of the sort of signature haplotypes for different, putative species, you'll find that they're cheek to jowl and they're not exchanging genes. So this is sort of the sine qua non of the biological species concept, that you can be in the same place at the same time but not have babies together. So that is yet further evidence to suggest that there really are lots and lots of mouse lemur species. You might say, well, why would we care about how many mouse lemur species there are? And that's a fairly valid question, but I would say there are all kinds of conservation implications in that if you can argue to the authorities that there's a single species of primate that's found in this one forest, and that's the only place on the entire earth that this species occurs, to lose that forest is to lose that species. And because we're primates, we tend to care more about primates, rightly or wrongly. So there are conservation implications, but there's also just sort of this information engine from this investigation. So this is a totally non-statistically robust analysis, but I just looked through the citation index, going back to when there was a 2-species taxonomy, then it went up to a 3 species, 4 species, 8 species, and these are the number of publications that are being published, or papers that are being published as the taxonomy expands. And I did a quick look at 2008, and there were 60 papers that mentioned mouse lemurs or microcebus in the title or the abstract. So there is this kind of, and it's hard to say whether it's cause and effect. Are we more interested in mouse lemurs because we're interested in how many species there are, or are we recognizing more species because we're interested and therefore we know more about them? But it is a pattern for sure, and it doesn't, for me it doesn't really matter what's causing it, but it's worth noting. Okay, but let's go back. So we know Madagascar's out there in the middle of the ocean. It's 62 million years ago. Lemurs are starting to do their thing. How the heck did they get there in the first place? Well, believe it or not, this is the best explanation we have. No, without the boat. And there's hopefully, I will have more to say about this later in the summer if a paper is published that I just reviewed, which might suggest a mechanism by which this would have occurred. But it's not out yet, and I don't even know if it's going to be accepted. But let's just say that there's evidence that there were strong currents going from Africa to Madagascar at around the time that lemurs and some of the other mammals were evolving. So this actually is probably the best explanation, that there was a dispersal, overwater dispersal event that got lemurs to Madagascar. Okay, so to summarize, the current data as they exist give a remarkably strong signal that present-day biota is predominantly made up of what we call neo-endemics, meaning they're unique to Madagascar, but they're new in the sense that they arrived in Madagascar after it was isolated from other land masses. And if you look at, there are tons and tons of other groups of organisms where if you do these similar kinds of analyses, you get the same kind of answers. Single origin, and much more recently than when Madagascar was conjoined with any other landmass. So For me, as a conservation biologist, one of the main points is that lemurs and other Malagasy endemics are unique evolutionary experiments. They are precious and irreplaceable. So if you think of evolution as sort of a continuing experiment, this is something that cannot be replicated. I mean, this is tens of millions of years of evolutionary tinkering to give us this beautiful array of primates and other organisms. And once we lose them, that's it, they're gone. That's a lot of evolution lost. And sadly, lemurs and other biota in Madagascar are severely endangered. I mean, it's sort of notorious. And for a long time, it was just slash and burn agriculture. So it was, really very complicated in that, you can't go into a village and say, stop feeding your family because we care more about lemurs. So it's really, it needs to be an integrated solution. But now there's all kinds of pressure from mining companies and petroleum companies, and there's a political crisis going on that I'll tell you about in just a minute that's making this extremely urgent at present. So one of the aspects of my work has been to collaborate with this guy right here, Steve Goodman, who has something called the Ecological Training Program in Madagascar, where he's trained over 200 Malagasy students in ecological methods and sort of evolutionary biology and other scientific training. And he has started an NGO called Vahatra, which is Malagasy for the root, and it's now run by Malagasy scientists. So he's a remarkable man, and it's been my great pleasure to work with him over the last 15 years or so. And so we have this really cool thing going where we're in the lab, we're doing this genetic, phylogenetic, morphological stuff, and we're feeding him questions, and he's going into the field and collecting samples and, looking at behavior and ecology and physiology and feeding stuff back to us. And it's just this great scientific cycle that's just a ton of fun. And also, it has taken me to Madagascar. And so here we have Air Madagascar, fine aircraft. And this is how one gets from one village to another, if you're lucky, or maybe you have a river you have to cross, or perhaps you just get in a little boat, or you walk. This is how one gets around Madagascar. In one case, we had to traverse a crocodile-infested river, and this was how we did it. Here's our Jeep right here. And we, roll up on the Jeep, and then we get poled across. And that we found out about the crocodiles because our Malagasy colleagues and students were talking with this guy, and everybody was, there was a lot of excited conversation. And so we got to the other side, and I said, "What was that all about?" Meanwhile, we're all hanging off at the side of this, Jeep, nearly falling into the water, and it's not a very stable vessel. And they said, "Oh, yeah, just last week this woman got eaten by a crocodile while she was doing her laundry." And we're like, "Oh, great," But this was at least when we had gotten to the other side. So, and then they're all matter of other conveyances, ox cart and. I forget what rickshaw in Asia, but they have a different name for it in Madagascar. And then sometimes you just have to drive across the river. And this is an enterprising young man from a local village who each day, because the river is shifting overnight and during the course of the day, each day he would go out and he would figure out the shallowest part of the river, and he would stand there and wait for a car to show up. And he'd say, for basically 50 cents or less, I'll show you the best way to go. And so, we just trucked, you just put your hand, your faith in him, and there you go. So this was pretty hairy, but we made it. And then there's all kinds of fun to be had if you're looking for fossils in particular, and that the site has to be blessed by the village elder, and there's a lot of rum involved, and it's usually at dawn, so you're drinking rum at dawn, getting ready to dig in the earth all day in the hot sun. It can be really interesting. And also you become instantly rich when you go to Madagascar. So this is my colleague and friend, John Flynn at the American Museum, and his friend and colleague, Andy Weiss. And there they are, rolling in dough because there's 6,000 FMG to the dollar, although I hear inflation has taken a toll lately. And then, there's always some place to get a Teash Bay, which is the local beer, Three Horses beer. And this is a little roadside bar. It's called The Friend. And then there's this wonderful place that's right on the Mozambique Channel where you can sit and have punch cocoa. So this is just to say that field work in Madagascar can be a blast. And the people could not be more delightful, lovely, generous, kind, wonderful people. So I've always wanted to help, and I want to help the lemurs and I want to help the people. So how do we do that? So I, as an investigator, have I taught a course at the University of Antananarivo in spring of 1997, and it was just like a life-changing experience. And I thought this is something that I want to do from here on out. So at Northwestern, I taught a conservation genetics course and brought some Malagasy scholars over for the summer. Did that at Yale. I've been doing it at Duke, and we have fun at Duke too. We go to the beach. And the idea being that, the methods are learned, scientific principles are learned, and then it's taken back to the ground in Madagascar where it can really be applied by the, conservators, the owners of their own island. And it's working, as I said about Steve's work. But presently, Madagascar is in crisis, and it's moderating a little bit, but this is not an overstatement. So on March 13th of 2009, the U.S. State Department issued a warning that Madagascar's political crisis has entered a dangerous phase, and they had warned against all tourism and non-essential business, and they had non-essential Americans leave Madagascar. So it's really bad. It was a straight-out coup d'état with a military takeover of the government. But as conservationists, what concerns us most is that while the new Malagasy government is otherwise preoccupied, some park rangers have left their post, and armed groups are cutting down valuable rosewood trees and other keystone trees. These activities are threatening animals such as the silky shifaka, which is one of the 25 most endangered primates in the world. So basically what's going on, particularly up in the Northeast, is that armed bandits are going into the forest and they're cutting down trees, and there's nothing to stop them. There's no government to stop them. I mean, there wasn't much of a government to stop them before, but at least there was something, and now there's nothing. So the forests are being razed at just breathtaking rates right now. So one of the reasons that I came to direct the Duke Lemur Center was because I wanted a bigger platform from which to do this conservation work. And so the Duke Lemur Center, just to tell you a little bit about it, and it's right down the road in Durham, we have about 210 individual animals, and that's as of today. We're growing. And we have 21 species, depending on your species concept. So we have quite a few lemurs. And we have a tripartite mission, which is conservation, education, and research. So we do research at the Lemur Center, but it is all benign and non-invasive. So at the end of the day, as I put it, the end of the day, the lemur goes back to his family and has that glass of wine and kicks up and talks about his, what he did during the day. And this is just an example of some of the non-invasive research that we do. This is Liz Brannon, who is a professor in the psychology department, and she's studying whether lemurs can count and ordinate, and so this is a touch screen that the lemur initiates the trial, and then this lemur likes to pick its target with its nose, so it's like touching the targets, and they are remarkable. So we have found that lemurs are a whole lot smarter than we thought they were, so we now can surmise that the ancestral primate was a pretty smart creature. But the point I want to make right now is that life is good at the Lemur Center. So if you're a lemur at the Lemur Center, you're a happy creature. There's a lot of hang time, lots of babies, and lots of time to romp in the trees. It also offers a great opportunity for students of all sorts to have a semi-field experience without having to go all the way to Madagascar. And this is particularly important right now, where it has been very potentially hazardous to go to Madagascar. So you can go out in the woods and follow lemurs around and pretend like you're a field biologist. And here's some shifaks up in the tree. This is Leslie Digby, who's one of our faculty. So we do that at the Lemur Center. We also do a lot of work on the ground in Madagascar, and these are programs that were initiated by two of our staff members, Andrea Katz and Charlie Welsh, a married couple, and they lived in Madagascar for 15 years and started a couple of really important projects. And this is actually a guy teaching the villagers how to compost so that they can be more productive with their agricultural techniques. We also bring Malagasy students now to the Lemur lemur center and trained them there in veterinary medicine and other, and lemur husbandry and so on. But the project I think that I'm most proud about in its conservation impact was the reintroduction of these black and white rough lemurs back to Madagascar. So over the years 1997, 98, and 2001, a total of 13 animals were released in a place called Betampoon Nature Reserve. And what I want to point out, so anyway, these lemurs went, the local populations were genetically in trouble. So we thought we'll return some good genes to the population and revitalize them. That was sort of the main goal. And that has worked. The lemurs, have survived. Many, some of them got eaten by Fusa, but that's life as a lemur in the wild. But they've had babies and grandbabies, so that part of it worked. But the really cool thing is, and this is a Google Earth image, if you look, there's this perfect polygon of protected natural forest in Madagascar, and it still exists because of this project, because of all the patrolling and the surveillance of these lemurs. If we had not done this project, I can promise you that would have been as devastated as these areas around it. So thanks to these black and white rough lemurs from the Lemur Center, we still have some beautiful, pristine lowland rainforest in Madagascar. And also, we've been fortunate. I was telling you about now the banditos are going in and cutting down trees. We've had a couple of very generous donors who have funded patrols in Madagascar. So we are now patrolling Betampoon and also its sister project, Ivalaween, and protecting these forests against these bandits. Okay, so to close, I asked, what would Darwin say? And I found one quote that I want to finish with, and this was something that Darwin did say. He says, and this is in The Origin of Species, "We see in many cases that rarity precedes extinction, and we know that this has been the progress of events with those animals which have been exterminated, either locally or wholly, through man's agency. To feel no surprise at the rarity of a species and yet to marvel greatly when the species ceases to exist is much the same as to feel no surprise at sickness, but when the sick man dies, to wonder and to suspect that he died by some deed of violence." He was just a very elegant writer, but this is my sort of summary. Act now and prevent regret later. So act. Thank you.